It's kind of crazy when you think about it. How did this one relatively small, pretty rainy island up in the North Atlantic manage to shape so much of the modern world? It's a story that is just packed with invasion, chaos, and constant reinvention. A journey from being the one who gets conquered to becoming the conqueror. So let's dive in and see how it all went down.
So that's the big question we're going to try and answer here. How did this happen? We're going to peel back the layers of English history, all the way from the beginning, to figure out how it transformed from this remote Roman outpost into a massive global empire. And maybe most importantly, how its language became this incredible mosaic of its own wild and turbulent past. All right, here's our game plan. We're going to start way back when Britain was literally attached to Europe. Then we'll meet the first big waves of invaders who laid the groundwork. After that, we hit the year that changed everything. Then we'll navigate through the messy but crucial Middle Ages. And finally, we'll watch as modern Britain is born. So our story kicks off thousands and thousands of years ago, a time when you could actually just walk from what's now France to England. Seriously, the land was connected by this low-lying area called Doggerland. But then the last ice age ended, sea levels rose, and poof, it was gone, flooded, and Britain was officially an island. Now, even after it became an island, Britain was hardly cut off. People just kept coming, wave after wave of migrants from the continent, bringing all sorts of new stuff with them, new tech like farming, new ways of living, and over hundreds of years, all of this blended together to create this widespread Celtic culture that the very first Roman invaders would run into. Okay, so this is where things start to get really interesting. We get to the first major outside forces that really began to hammer out a unique identity for this island. And these three groups, the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, and the Vikings, man, they each left a mark that you can still see today. Just look at this timeline. It's this relentless cycle of people showing up. You've got Julius Caesar in 55 BC, which was really more of a test run. It took almost 100 years for Emperor Claudius to come back and do the job right. But then, in 407 AD, Rome packs up and leaves, creating this massive power vacuum. Well, nature abhors a vacuum, and in rush the next group, the Anglo-Saxons. And just as they're getting comfortable, who shows up on the horizon? The Vikings.
And here's the thing, none of these groups were just passing through. The Romans, they were incredible builders. They founded cities like London that are still the heart of England. The Anglo-Saxons, they gave England its political DNA and, most importantly, its language. And the Vikings, who started as these terrifying raiders, eventually settled down, took over a huge part of the country called the Danelaw, and started mixing their own words into the local language. This really gets to the heart of it. This is probably the single most important thing the Anglo-Saxons left behind. I mean, sure, they were politically all over the place with their 7 different kingdoms, but that shared Germanic language they all spoke, that was the bedrock, the absolute foundation of what would one day become English. By the late 800s, it really looked like it was all over for the Anglo-Saxons. The Vikings had this massive force they called the Great Heathen Army, and it had steamrolled 3 of the 4 main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Only Wessex was left standing, led by this one guy, Alfred. His victory at the Battle of Edington wasn't just a battle, it was the turning point that literally saved the Anglo-Saxon identity and the future of England itself.
Which brings us to the next absolutely massive moment in this story. Look, if you remember just one date from all of English history, please make it 1066. This single year was like a giant earthquake that completely and forever changed the country's destiny. The story of 1066 is just incredible. You couldn't make it up. So King Edward dies with no heir. Boom, a 3-way scramble for the throne. The new guy, Harold Godwinson, barely has time to sit down before he has to march his army all the way north to fight off a Viking invasion from Norway. He wins this amazing bloody battle, only to get the news that William of Normandy has just landed in the south. So he has to turn his exhausted army around and force march them 250 miles back down, where they get defeated at the Battle of Hastings. What a year. And the change was just total. Overnight, the entire Anglo-Saxon ruling class was basically wiped out and replaced by this new French-speaking elite. For the next 300 years, you had 2 different Englands living side by side. The rulers and nobles spoke French, and all the common folk spoke Old English. This actually created one of my favorite quirks in the language. The Anglo-Saxon peasants out in the fields raised the animals, so we get words like cow, sheep, and pig. But the Norman lords who ate the fancy meals gave us the French words for the meat on the plate: beef, mutton, and pork.
So the centuries that followed 1066 were, well, they were anything but quiet. England got rocked by civil wars, wars with France, and a plague so bad it's hard to even imagine. But here's the crazy part. It was through all of this intense, violent chaos that a more unified English identity actually started to take shape.
And a perfect example of this is the Magna Carta. You had this king, King John, who was just a disaster, lost a ton of land in France, then tried to tax everyone to death. His barons finally had enough, rebelled, and literally forced him to sign this document. And this was the very first time anyone had put down in writing the idea that the king wasn't above the law. That's a world-changing idea, a concept that would echo for centuries all across Western civilization.
And then came a catastrophe on a completely different level. The Black Death. It killed almost half the population in just a couple of years. But this absolute horror story had this unbelievable, unexpected side effect. Suddenly, there was a massive labor shortage. The peasants who survived were now in high demand. They could ask for better pay, for more rights. And just like that, the rigid old feudal system that had been locked in place for centuries began to crack. So after a long, expensive war with France finally sputtered out, England's powerful families basically turned on each other. The Wars of the Roses was this brutal 30-year family feud for the throne between two rival branches of the royals. It was bloody, it was messy, and it finally ended at the Battle of Bosworth Field. That battle wiped out a huge chunk of the old nobility and brought a brand new powerful dynasty to the throne, the Tudors. Which of course brings us to one of the most famous kings in all of history, Henry VIII. And really, his whole story boils down to one simple problem. He was desperate for a son to secure his new Tudor dynasty, but his first wife only gave him a daughter. When the Pope wouldn't grant him a divorce, Henry did something radical. He just broke England away from the Catholic Church entirely, created his own Church of England, and made himself the boss, a move that would define England's identity for hundreds of years. So after all the religious drama that followed Henry, his youngest daughter, Elizabeth I, takes the throne. And her long reign is known as a golden age. It was a time of stability, incredible art and culture. We're talking about Shakespeare here. And this growing sense of confidence on the world stage. And that confidence was cemented when England's small navy managed to defeat the supposedly invincible Spanish Armada in 1588. It was a huge upset, and it signaled a major power shift in Europe. Okay, we're in the home stretch now. This is where England really solidifies its modern political system, joins up with its northern neighbor Scotland, and starts looking outward to build a global empire. The 1600s were basically the final showdown, king versus parliament. Who really gets to run the country? It kicked off with a bloody civil war that ended with something unthinkable. They chopped off the king's head. Decades later, another king was kicked out in what they called the Glorious Revolution, mostly because it was bloodless. And the end result, written down in the Bill of Rights, was crystal clear. Parliament, not the king, held the ultimate power. Now, for about a century, the same monarch had been ruling both England and Scotland, but they were still two totally separate countries. That all changed in 1707. The Acts of Union officially merged the two kingdoms, their parliaments, everything. And the single political entity we know as Great Britain was born. And with its political house finally in order, Britain was ready to take on the world. It had the economic engine of the Industrial Revolution roaring at home and the unmatched power of the Royal Navy protecting its interests abroad. And for the next 200 years, Great Britain built the largest empire the world has ever seen. That long journey from conquer to conqueror was complete. And you know, when you boil it all down, the most incredible legacy of this entire story is the language you're hearing right now. English is like a living museum of its own history. We've got Latin words from the Romans for things like law and religion, like testament or scripture. The core of the language, everyday words like house, woman, and loaf, that's all Germanic from the Anglo-Saxons. We've got tough, gritty words from the Vikings like sky, leg, and skin. And it's just overflowing with fancy French words from the Normans for government and fine dining like parliament, sovereign, and dinner. It's all in there. So that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. If a language is really the autobiography of its people, a record of everything they've been through, then what does the future of English tell us? This language, born from centuries of invasion and mixing on one little island, is now spoken all over the globe. What does its continued evolution tell us about the deeply interconnected world that we all share today?